So hello and welcome to the 792nd meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO of the club. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. Before we begin, I want to extend a warm welcome to students joining us today from Mercer University and the Cooney Graduate Center, as well as members of the 2025 class of ECNY Fellows, a select group of diverse, rising, next-gen business thought leaders. We're also wanting to extend a special welcome to members of the New York Women's Forum joining us today. The Economic Club of New York is proud to stand as the nation's leading nonpartisan platform for discussions on economic, social, and political issues. We've been doing this for more than a century, I think, as many of you know. Today, we're privileged to continue that tradition as we welcome our distinguished guest, Zanny Minton Beddoes. Zanny is the editor-in-chief of The Economist, one of the most respected publications on global affairs in the world of business, finance, and again, global affairs. She's been at The Economist for over 20 years, previously serving as business affairs editor, economics editor, and emerging markets correspondent. She has traveled extensively, covering fundamental key financial and economic developments across Latin America, Eastern Europe, and beyond. Her deep expertise spans global finance, economic policy, and international markets. Before joining The Economist, Zanny worked as an economist at the International Monetary Fund, focusing on macroeconomic programs in both Africa and Eastern Europe. She's also served as an advisor to Poland's Minister of Finance, working along Professor Jeffrey Sachs on economic reforms during a pivotal time in that country's transition. Her thought leadership has shaped discussions on EU's enlargement, the future of the IMF, and emerging markets. She's written for Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, contributed to major economic volumes, and even testified before Congress on the introduction of the euro. Beyond her writing, she's very much sought after as a commentator, appearing frequently on BBC, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, PBS, NPR, and now the Economic Club, offering insights on the most pressing economic issues of our time. She holds degrees from Oxford University and Harvard University. Our format today will be a fireside chat. We're honored to have club member and former club trustee Mark Gallogly as our moderator. Mark is the founder and managing principal of Cairns Group. Time permitting, we will take questions from the audience. A reminder, this discussion is on the record and we do have media following this both in the room and online. We're going to conclude as we always do, probably at 1 o'clock. And now without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Zanny and Mark.
Okay. We had to flip a coin. Who would get to wear red and who would get to wear blue? Okay. I wanted red and there is another suit in the other. Okay, Zanny, so nice to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. The Economist is 182 years old. For 182 years old, this remarkable institution, really remarkable, has clearly valued free people, free markets, and intelligent discussion. For 10 years, last 10 or 11 years, since 2014, Zanny has led The Economist, the first woman to do that. And she's done it with really great precision in a world where where the world is changing a lot. If you listen to their podcasts or their movement now to video, it's a very, very powerful movement, which is why their number of subscribers is growing. Okay, over to you, Zanny.
Thank you. Thank you for that advertorial. That was very kind.
It's so true. Is Donald Trump good for the US economy?
Ooh, you start with the simple question. So my one word answer is no, but let me explain further. The last time I was here before this trip was in the week after the election. And I was in New York and I was struck by the extraordinary exuberance that you saw in markets, but also amongst everyone I talked to. The expectation that this presidency would bring much needed deregulation, more tax cuts, Don't worry about the tariffs. He just negotiates. He just talks about that. Don't worry too much about deportation and clamps on immigration. Well, we need to get immigration under control, the border under control, but basically this is going to be great for the US economy. That's what I heard. And you saw that obviously reflected in markets. This week, I have detected, at the very least, a greater concern. At the very least, a concern that maybe this tariff stuff is for real. Maybe the behavior towards allies is a little alarming. Maybe this is going to be more dangerous than we thought. And obviously you see what's going on in markets. And we, as you know, if you read The Economist, we endorsed Vice President Harris, not for any great enthusiasm for the vice president. We were incredibly critical of the Biden administration's economic policies, and I suspect they would have been worse under a President Harris. But the reason that we plumped in the end for that choice was that I and my colleagues worried about the tail risks of a Trump administration. We worried that we hoped if he were to become president, it would all be okay, but we worried that things could go very wrong. And I'm now more worried than I was in November. And let me explain why. I think that President Trump believes in tariffs. He has been a protectionist for decades. If you go back to the 1980s, he was taking out ads in the New York Times railing against Japan. He has a worldview antithetical to mine. If I work for The Economist, which was founded to fight for free trade, that tariffs are good for America. And he is determined, I think, right now to implement that worldview. And people have always thought, well, he will be constrained by the markets. And when the stock market goes down, he will be constrained. And he uses them as a negotiating tool. You know, both of those may prove to be right, but I actually think if you look, and I'm being, trying perhaps to be slightly provocative here, if you look at the sycophancy of the advisors around him, who are all like courtiers, essentially trying to get the ear of the king, I'm not sure that he is being given clear advice about how damaging some of this stuff is. And I think he's increasingly sure of his own wisdom in this. And when he starts saying it'll be a little bumpy, I think he thinks he is fundamentally changing the nature of the US economy back to something that perhaps it had in the late 19th century, when it was indeed doing well behind a tariff wall, but it was a very, very different kind of environment. So I really worry that this is a sort of, if not an economic strategy, at least it's a belief system. The bit that really has kind of surprised me in the last 6 weeks, that I just wasn't on my radar screen, is the bullying of allies and the seeming territorial expansionism. Panama, Greenland, Canada is the 51st state, the outright hostility towards Europe, which if you're in Europe, you feel very, very strongly. And yes, some of it is rhetoric, but when Vice President Vance came to the Munich Security Conference and gave that speech, I was in the room when that happened, and the shock in the audience was palpable. People could not believe their ears. They thought they were going to hear just one second. And you could say, it's actions, not rhetoric, that matters. But when you see the actions of the last few weeks, cutting off military support and intelligence to Ukraine, yes, it's been reinstated now, but cutting it off, essentially doing nothing to be tough to Putin and being very tough on Ukraine, starting to say, well, maybe the Japanese defense alliance wasn't so great for us. These are all things, if you're outside the United States, that you start worrying about. And as that's all been going on, we've had a lot of noise around Doge, but actually not a huge amount of deregulation yet, not a huge amount of the positive things that people were hoping for. So if you add all of that up together, I think the indicators thus far don't suggest to me that this is going to be a recipe for roaring economic success.
So this is the thing about The Economist. You get the world. You get everything. So what you just described was the US economy, Europe, geopolitics, the relationship to Japan. You get a broad stroke. Let's take a minute and dive into each of those a little more deeply. So let's take the US economy first. And by the way, we will have time for questions. So get your questions ready. We'll flip it over to you in about 15 minutes. Okay. The US economy the probability the US economy goes into a recession over the next let's say, during this year, what do you think it is?
During this year, 50%.
50%. And prior to President Trump's election, what would you have thought?
Much lower.
Much lower.
Close, yeah.
Okay, so the thing that he is doing, in addition to the thing the administration is doing, in addition to creating uncertainty in markets as a result of tariffs and some other issues, other than tariffs, what's the number one thing that you're concerned about that the president is doing?
I think it's uncertainty. It's if you're framing this, and
it's
rightly
true,
and
I'm
understandably
framing
in a kind of US focused, relatively short horizon time.
Yes.
And
at
first.
first.
So then, what is going to drive the economy into recession in the short term? It is, decline in consumption. It's a decline in investment. It's you can go through the components of the macro aggregates. I think we are seeing consumer confidence plunge. Mm-hmm. We are seeing small business confidence plunge. We are seeing what's happening in the markets. I think we're not going to get as much loosening from the Fed as we might want to because inflationary pressure is there. So just in a sort of, macro, very narrow macro short-term framework, I think the economy is looking weaker than it did a couple of months ago. But I guess my point when you said, is he good for the US economy, is not really about, is it mean that there's a recession this year or not? It's a sort of bigger prism, because I think fundamentally the US has benefited from an international system that it created and that it is now destroying. And I happen to think that ends up with the US in a worse place. But there is a counter to, the biggest counter to my argument is that I've talked about the kind of economic revolution that he's undertaking, that sort of shift towards protectionism. I've talked about the geopolitics. There's a third revolution going on right now, which is the AI revolution. And it's probably the most profoundly important of the three. And it is the one where the US is in the most dominant position. But even there, the news of the last 6 weeks or so, nothing to do with President Trump, but the news of the last 6 weeks or so, what you might call the deep seek revolution, suggests that actually the US is not as far ahead as it thinks, that this technology can diffuse faster, and that in fact, China might be adopting it rather faster than people realize. And so even on that third one, which has always been, I think, the ballast for the US economy, and one of the reasons the market was doing what it was doing last year is because I think there was an awful lot of productivity improvement from AI priced into the market. I think we may have to think somewhat differently about the relative winners and losers from AI.
So AI is such an important topic. I want to touch on Europe before we go to AI.
Okay.
So the Europeans, you were in the room when Vice President Vance spoke, and you said there was a shock. Describe that, and what do you think? Let's assume for a minute that the Europeans have an opportunity over the next number of weeks to conclude that shock was justified, that there's a fundamental shift going on. What will Europe do practically to insulate itself from a post-World War II stability that has been fundamentally altered?
So there's lots of elements to your question there. So in terms of describe the shock, the moment at the Munich Security Conference was one amongst elites, right? This is all the sort of geopolitical security elite. And it was a sort of palpable shock at hearing a vice president who appeared outright hostile to Europe. I talked later to a very prominent CDU politician, that's the Conservative Party. He said, "It's as though they're out to get us." I quote, that was his exact words privately. And that was a sense that the rhetoric that the vice president had, and indeed his actions, insisting on meeting Alice Weidel, the head of the Alternative für Deutschland, the far-right party, these were designed to kind of, at the very least, designed to provoke. But you could say, well, look, this is showmanship, but let's not take that too seriously. A second instance where I think Europeans were sort of visibly shocked was what happened in the White House with President Zelensky. That clip, I mean, literally everybody I know that I came across in those sort of days after that, whether it was my father, my 85-year-old father, whether it was, my kids' friends, people had watched it, and people were shocked by the behavior of the United States towards a president who was speaking in his third language, who has been fighting an aggression in his country. Now, again, it's a theater, so let's not take that too seriously. In terms of actions, I think the decision to stop supporting Ukraine militarily and cut off intelligence, although it's now been reversed, again, shocked people. Now, this may be a little blip, it may not be the direction, but it's been enough of a serial set of things that for Europe, now there's been a sudden realization that we cannot assume that our ally that has been underpinning European security, and the Europeans have not spent enough on defense for too long, that the country that's been underpinning that has actually got our back. In fact, it may not just not have our back, it may be outright hostile. That's the recognition that has happened. It's led to already several things. In the UK, it's led to a concerted, desperate appeal by Prime Minister Starmer to try and be the bridge across the Atlantic, to maintain the special relationship with the administration, but also to try and work with the French in particular to persuade the Trump administration to be part of a constructive solution for Ukraine. In continental Europe, particularly in Germany, I think it's been a wake-up moment. Friedrich Merz, who is the incoming chancellor, has, as I'm sure you know, along with the SPD, their likely coalition partners, have announced a dramatic, by German standards, dramatic changes to allow for increased borrowing for infrastructure, to radically loosen the constitutional constraints on borrowing, what they call the debt brake. They haven't got it through the coalition yet, but I'm pretty sure they will. That will have fundamental impacts on the amount that Germany will borrow. You're already seeing the impact in European equities, but particularly European bonds. It will create spending, and it could be, down the road, the beginnings of a bigger European market for safe assets. Now, Europe always disappoints in the sense that it just never does as much as it should do. So I'm not suggesting that we're definitely on a path to a vibrant Europe that will, stand on its own feet. But I think there has been a recognition that something has to change in Europe. And I think you are going to see higher defense spending, thus more domestic demand. Europe is not, it can do that with borrowing in the short term, but it can't do it. It's a highly taxed, high spending continent. It can't do it without faster growth. And just possibly this kickstart to defense spending could be the, what is needed to get a sclerotic European economy to be more deregulated and to be more innovative. For instance, in defense, actually some of the cutting edge technologies, particularly drone technologies, is being developed by Ukrainian companies and often with European support. If you could kickstart that defense industry and really build it up as part of the European shift, then you actually suddenly strengthen and you have a powerful European strength. So I've been down on Europe, as you know, if you read us. I mean, we've been incredibly down on Europe's potential, but I think what you're seeing in European equity markets is reflecting a shift in investor perception about what Europe could do from a very, very low base. That would be a good thing. And you could say, thank goodness. And maybe, President Trump is put alongside Jean Monnet in the kind of pantheon of people who, achieved European unity. But it's a big change.
Before we go to AI, let's go to China. Will China fill the void geopolitically that the United States is providing it?
I'm going to hedge much more about China. I'm going to China next week, and I'd give you a better answer after. I'm been there for 2 weeks. I haven't been there since the election. I think China is itself, its economy, notwithstanding the mini boom in AI, is in a huge funk. I mean, it really has Japan's debt problem and a big trade war and terrible demography. This is not a great combination for any country. And when I was in China this time last year, I go this time every year, there was a real sense of a sort of lost generation, young Chinese feeling that they were never going to get the opportunities of transformative wealth creation that their parents had, and a recognition that the political, the sort of authoritarianism was tightening down even as the economic prospects were looking grimmer. I'm interested to see what happens this time around, but I think that diplomatically, I don't think the Chinese are going to, immediately come in and start, funding the programs in Africa that the closure of USAID has ended. That's not their thing. That maybe more infrastructure stuff. That maybe it'll take a while. I think they are enjoying very much the sort of diplomatic nihilism, at the UN, at those kind of places of what is happening right now. And there will certainly be opportunistic attempts to increase Chinese influence. In many ways, this is sort of exactly what President Xi has been saying would happen, right? The United States could not be trusted. The United States was, a kind of craven place that was going to be very bad, was not upholding a rules-based order. All of the things that are now happening, I think the Chinese would say, "We told you so." The question I have is whether they can shift their own economy enough towards domestic consumption, which they really need to deal with this massive property bust, and continue to forge ahead in the areas where they are clearly ahead now, whether it's electric vehicles, whether it's all kind of high-tech areas. And the recent developments in AI that are coming out of China make me think that this technology is it's going to be like many other technologies, relatively easily diffused. Therefore, trying to keep ahead is very difficult. And if that's true, and if they adopt AI faster than firms in the United States do, which is also possible, then the West has a real problem, because I think China could actually end up being dramatically stronger from this. But they're in a big macroeconomic mess right now. So the question is, can they go from one to the other?
And last one on that trajectory. If the impact of the geopolitical change is a sphere of influence world, and China has its sphere, what do you think the implication of that will be for Asia?
I think for countries that currently rely on a US security umbrella, pretty grim.
And what do you think will happen as a result of that? What reaction will we see a nuclear Japan and nuclear Korea?
I think we're going to see, if the world continues on the trajectory that we've seen glimpses of in the last 6 weeks, I think one almost certain consequence is increased nuclear proliferation.
In
not just in Asia, in so South Korea and probably Japan. In the Middle East, the Saudis will definitely want to have nuclear weapons. And in Europe, countries will want to have nuclear capability of their own. They may share it. But right now, the UK technically has a nuclear capability, but it's utterly entwined with the United States. I think we can actually launch our nuclear missiles from our submarines, but their annual maintenance and all of that is all done by the Americans. The French have a slightly more independent system, but again,
the revenge of Charles de Gaulle.
It's time to be a neo-Gaullist.
Yeah.
I mean, that's that. And that is alarming. As an Atlanticist, that's what I think is so. And I sound like I sound more extreme than I am. I hope this doesn't come to pass. But enough has happened that I think in Europe, certainly, people are raising questions. And the alliance system, the great strength of the post-war alliance system, was that its trust in it was absolute. NATO is based on an absolute faith, whether you are in the Baltics, whether you are Poland, that if Vladimir Putin were to attack you, the US would come to your defense. At the very least, that faith has been dented. And in the end, that makes, I think, an alliance system much less tenable. And I think what's perhaps less recognized in this country is that, or at least by certain people in this country, that the US loses from that, because the US has tremendous force propagation from an alliance system. The US gains not just from the stability of a multilateral trade system, but the US gains from the influence that it is able to exert in that system. So take sanctions, for example. The US dominates. It's an incredibly powerful financial weapon, the sanction system. But if we are in a more fragmented world, and if we're in a world where allies don't feel that this alliance is really that helpful for them, then the ability to implement a successful sanctions regime is weakened.
You could approach AI in many ways, brief discussion about AI, but one way that a friend of mine who spends 100% of his time on that broad topic is that AGI happens quickly much more quickly than or quickly, let's call it that. And that ASI, artificial superior intelligence, follows very fast behind it because AGI accelerates the capacity of the machines in a way that we don't currently understand. And that has a massive impact on US employment and global employment over a short window of time, call it 5 years, 7 years. Do you think that's right? Or do you think that's not a reasonable way to think about it?
It's certainly a reasonable way to think. The honest answer is I have no idea. I talked to a bunch of people about this. I have a bunch of people writing about it, and I'm very struck that the people who really ought to know the best, so the founders of the companies that are building the foundational models, are by and large the most certain that we are very, very close to AGI and then to ASI. So I was on a stage recently and interviewing Dario Amodei, the founder of Anthropic, and Demis Hassabis, the founder of DeepMind. It was like the kind of, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones of AI together. And they both, I think Dario Amodei says it's AGI by 26, 27. Demis thinks it's a little bit later, but certainly within the next few years. And they both, as you say, once we have computers or models that are at AGI, they are going to themselves be generating an ASI very quickly. When that happens, the question is the technology going to diffuse quickly or not? And my instinct now is that it is going to happen very fast. But I'll give you one reason for tempering that, which was the parable of the tractor. Mm-hmm. So I didn't think I was going to go there. The tractor, which is a colleague of mine, wrote a very good piece a couple of years ago in our Christmas issue. The tractor was in the agrarian economy of the late 19th century, the equivalent of ChatGPT. It was the general purpose technology that would transform potentially the productivity of agriculture. And tractors were invented in like 1890s. And in whatever the Prairie Gazette or whatever the media, the equivalent of The Economist was at the time, there was lots of hype about tractors were going to change everything and the future of agriculture was going to be completely transformed. In 1920, only 5% of American farms used tractors. And in 1940, only 25% did. So it diffused incredibly slowly. And there are lots of reasons. The smallness of agricultural holdings meant it not worth doing such a big capital investment, but there were lots of reasons. But the main point is that despite it being transformative technology, it diffused very slowly. So that, if that parallel holds this time, you might think, well, actually, the technology will diffuse quite slowly. The internet actually diffused relatively slowly in terms of companies using the internet. It took quite a long time. I'm not sure I agree this time around because I think this is so powerful and so transformative, it'll be quicker. Much quicker. And from what I gather, the US adoption rates are much higher than in Europe. That's no surprise. Adoption, really serious adoption and transformation in startups is much, much deeper than in established companies. Question, will China actually adopt much faster? Because competition is incredibly intense in China. If that's the case, then America's position is not so, is a bit more tenuous. But to get back to your question, the really interesting point is that if adoption here is fast, and if you have the incredible improvements of productivity that come from that, then you are going to have, as you say, a tremendous labor market shock. And the entire premise of this administration's protectionism, which is to bring back jobs to America and rebuild and have a sort of manufacturing renaissance here, will be wiped out, I think, because the kind of investment that will be made here will be using AI-led capabilities, which will not involve creating jobs for people. And so there's a great irony that an administration which wants to accelerate the adoption of AI and is full of Silicon Valley crypto tech bros who want to do more there and remove constraints, and frankly, which I would be in favor of, but that is going to bring a disruption of a sort which will, I think, completely undermine what they're trying to do with their misguided protectionism.
So this tractor analogy is so interesting. Tractors don't build combines and they don't build everything else. And between 20 and 40 happened the Great Depression. So the speed, I agree with your earlier statement. It's just faster, slightly faster.
I think it's going to be much faster.
And it might happen under this administration.
But that's what's so alarming.
And that's, go ahead.
That's, I mean, if what I'm going to sound like I'm completely freaked out about everything. I'm not, but I do think that it is.
What are you not freaked out about? Can you give us a?
Yeah, AI is going to have lots of great things. We're all going to live much longer, and there'll be lots of benefits. But we are in the midst of 3 revolutions, each of which will be profound enough to be a sort of chapter in our grandchildren's history books. The one we've talked a lot about is the geopolitical one, really the end of the 8 decades of the post-war alliance. The second is an economic one, which, whatever you call it, we're moving away from a world of free trade and globalization to something very different. And then the third is this technological one, which is, the biggest since at least the Industrial Revolution. And I think you and I, it sounds like we agree, faster and much more dramatic than that. You put those 3 things together, that is an extraordinary cocktail. And I think the 3 of them will interact in ways that are hard to predict.
I don't know that we need more freaking out, but I'll say that there's a 4th.
Oh my Lord.
We're at 1.5 degrees.
Climate, yeah.
And it's pretty clear that we're going to 2.5 degrees. 2.5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, and the poles are 3 times as hot. So you just have to think about what that means in an Africa that has 1.4 billion people today and is going closer to 3.5 billion people and getting much hotter. So anyway, that's a 4th. If you want to freak out, that's your 4th. Okay, we're going to open it up to questions now. And please do a question, not a wonderful piece by The Economist. Okay, yes, please. And then we'll get maybe 3 quick questions from the audience and then hand it over to Zanny. Yes, please. Say your name for us.
Ramila. Thank you, Ramila. Thank you, Zanny, for your insightful comments on current events now. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are regarding your target readership nowadays. I remember when I had first subscribed to The Economist right out of college as an analyst. How do you think that audience has evolved, given all the disruption in media and tech?
How has what evolved? Say it one more time.
The target audience.
Audience has evolved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who else had a question? And we'll get a second microphone to you while we wait. Okay, all the way in the back over there. Go ahead.
Thank you. Brilliant as always. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your comments. When I think about President Trump and what he is doing, and I heard your comments, it strikes me, if all, as you lay out the case, 3 revolutions colliding at the same time, the seismicity of the upending that is happening also calls inherently, historically, has always been the case, whether by volition or it is forced upon society and times, dramatic reimagination. Mm-hmm. Bretton Woods and those sets of institutions were a function of that. And the seismicity was what transpired from 1914 to 1944. Viewed from that standpoint, I do think that one needs to give more time for this to play out in all of the participants, including, as you pointed out, delinking spending from something so deeply the part of the German side.
So reimagine the world, and over what period of time? Go with say your question one more time. Say tightly. You got it? Okay. That's why she's the head of The Economist. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm Amy Ho. So you kind of went around the world in Trump's perspective, Europe, China. Can you touch on Taiwan, especially with this AI revolution kind of happening? Taiwan's a big piece of it. Reunification, is that going to happen anytime soon? Will Trump allow it, or will he kind of just do this whole protectionism? We're not sending anyone there. It's not within our kind of sphere. Too bad, so sad kind of thing.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me start with your. I think in your question was, given that the world is changing so dramatically, shouldn't one give this administration's approach more time because history suggests that you always need, you need to have a wholly different architecture for a new world. And I agree with you that it's pointless clinging to an old world that is dead. So I'm not advocating that we try and prolong the death pangs of the post-1945 order at all. I think you're absolutely right that this is, we are at the beginning of something new, and we need to build it. What worries me is that if you look back in history, these transformational periods, some of them have ended well, some of them have only ended well after terrible violence and terrible destructiveness. And I would like us, if possible, to avoid that. And so that's where my concern comes from. And my concern comes from those three revolutions together. I have no doubt that this is a revolutionary administration. In fact, somebody said to me the other day, and I will be able to validate it once I go to China, but someone said to me that in Beijing, they are advising people to read Chairman Mao's first letter on the Cultural Revolution to understand what is happening in Washington. If that is indeed true, that gives you a sense of how around the world people think of this as a revolutionary moment. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, but what we've been talking about is why I think there are some reasons for alarm about the kind of who is focusing on what we're creating now. And it would be good to avoid the violence. On Taiwan, which is a really good sort of concrete example of this, I have no idea what's going to happen in Taiwan. I think it's very clear that President Xi is determined to reunify China. It's an absolute focus, priority of his. It's also, if you read John Bolton's memoirs of the first Trump administration, that the president, pointed out to him that Taiwan was the Sharpie on the Resolute desk in terms of its relative importance. So I also, you hear the rhetoric about, Taiwan isn't grateful for what the US has done for it, and the desire to reshore a lot of chip manufacturing. That's going to take a while. There are also, however, a lot of China hawks in this administration, genuine China hawks, who genuinely think the biggest focus for the US should be the deterrence and control of this dangerous autocracy. So I don't know where all of that hangs out. If you ask me to if you force me to make a prediction, I don't think President Xi will do a sort of full-on D-Day landing style invasion. There's no need to do that. You can squeeze Taiwan. You can affect its domestic political, firmament. You can, put pressure on Taiwan. And I don't expect the Trump administration to do too much about that. But if there were some kinetic action, I am not at all sure that this president would essentially escalate, which all the battle plans suggest the US would have to do in order to save Taiwan. That would be my, and then in terms of The Economist.
The audience.
So the people who pay us money, our subscribers, are disproportionately, affluent men of means of a certain generation. But my hope is, that's the basic subscriber base. Our podcast listeners are much younger and much more diverse. And we are trying to reach a broader audience through our short form videos, where we're trying to, warm up the audience of tomorrow. And my goal is that I hope the kind of insight that we try to do, the kind of rigorous fact-based analysis, is useful for a new generation as it was for the last generation. And what our job is to get that analysis to people in the form that they want. So, my daughter wouldn't be seen dead reading The Economist. She listens to all our podcasts. So I think we need different mediums for different generations. Short form video, I think, is very powerful. We're actually very strong on Instagram and even on TikTok. They're good. They're really good, the short form videos. Podcasts the same. So I think it's the nature of the audience. I hope. We're all hopefully living longer, but nonetheless, I would like to, ensure that we attract the next generation too. But the core to doing that is to be true to what we've always been, which is to be, I hope, sufficiently rigorous, open-minded, analytical, that even if you disagree with our editorial viewpoint, that you find our analysis useful and interesting. And that's what we're trying to do for every generation of listener, watch, viewer, or reader.
We have 10 more minutes, so we'll take 3 more questions and then I'll do one wrap-up question. Yes, sir. So say your name and a short question. Thank you.
My name is Mark Zashin. Going to one of your issues in The Economist, something else that could be revolutionary that was in one of your articles, or the subject of it, was inheritocracy, and how that is in the United States and how it's going to be affecting the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very good point. Thank you for mentioning it. It was a package a couple of weeks ago that we ran. And the sort of headline of that is, and it's actually interestingly, and I hadn't realized this until my colleagues put it together, it's actually a bigger phenomenon in Europe because Europe is slow growing. But increasingly,
and has more of a history of it, I guess.
Well, it's and the housing prices, it's tied up in housing wealth, but broadly the share of inherited wealth as a share of GDP has doubled in Europe. And increasingly for young people now, life chances are determined more by whether or not they inherit than by what job they do. And that is a terrible place for societies to be in. And we have always argued against that. In this country,
your children don't like that as much.
My children.
That you argue against inheritance.
I haven't, yeah, they rail against I've had interesting conversations with them about the difference in, ability to buy a flat in London now is hugely dependent on the bank of mum and dad. Yeah. And those, people who, however good the university they went to, however good a job they've got, they are not going to be able to, get a foot into the London real estate market without some kind of help. And that's a corrosive place to be.
So we have about 7 minutes. We're going to take 3 quick questions. Ma'am. Yes.
Discussion in Europe about the euro becoming a new reserve currency.
Okay. Yes. Sir.
Thank you. My question is, as an optimist, and I have a clear understanding about the geopolitics and how I connect the data, economics and politics. In my view, President Trump is racing towards to get a Nobel Prize. That's what he's working towards, solving the problems. Probably he's not get hold of every issue, but I would love to hear your comment. Is he up for the Nobel Prize before the way Obama administration won within a year's time?
Okay.
Last question from the audience. Yes, Ralph.
I think all of us have grown up with the premise that the media was one of the major checks and balances in our society. I'd love to hear you discuss some of the challenges of covering our current administration.
Thank you.
Okay, great questions. Yes, there's talk in Europe. There always has been talk about trying to be a reserve currency. I think reserve currencies take years, decades to shift. We're a long, long way from displacing the dollar. But I do think what's happened in Europe right now, if this increased defense spending is for real, there will at last be a greater pool of safe assets in Europe. But it's a long, long way from displacing the dollar. On President Trump wanting a Nobel Prize, I agree. I think President Obama got one, so he probably wants 2. I don't know what the Nobel Committee will do, but just to be clear, I think that this shake-up approach to geopolitics, there are arenas where it could be successful. It's possible that it'll be successful in Ukraine. I think the place where I'm most optimistic is that it could achieve something is in the Middle East, where I think that one of my regrets is that in the first Trump administration, we did not put the Abraham Accords on the cover, and we should have done. It was a really significant achievement. And I think in the sclerotic, decadal lack of progress in the Middle East, this kind of shakeup could achieve results. I don't think Mara Gaza is going to happen anytime soon, but I think that kind of shakeup could be useful. So just to be clear, there are from, shaking up the Pentagon to, there are lots of areas where I think this administration could do really good things. I don't want to leave the impression that I'm sort of critical on all. I'm absolutely not. There are lots and lots of areas where things could be improved for the better. Ralph, the road of the media. So I thank my lucky stars every day right now for the independence of The Economist. I mean, we are commercially independent in that we have no single proprietor who can decide that we will change our editorial line on X, Y, and Z. And we have a constitution that prevents a single proprietor. And we have a tradition upheld by a very complicated trusteeship of editorial independence. So when we decide what we write, what our views are going to be, the fealty is only to the classic liberalism that we were founded to champion in 1843. And that is it's a very nice thing to have now, to not have to worry about anything other than what we think is the right thing to say. Do I think there is, it's different for other media organizations? Are we completely unaffected? No, we have, it was interesting in the circular that went around to the State Department employees about the cancellation of certain media subscriptions. There were 6 named and we were top of the list, and it was not in alphabetical order. So, there are consequences, but I think the media environment, even here, the media is still strong. It's important that you do rigorous, fair-minded work. And I think it's important, and if you read us, you know that we will give credit where credit is due, and there are many things that this administration is doing that we have applauded, and there are many things that the previous administration did that we criticized, and we're not partisan. And I think that maintaining the respect of people who disagree with your editorial line through the rigor of your work is really essential right now. And so that's what we're trying to do.
Maybe our last 2 topics could be about, do you have one question, ma'am?
Just about the US deficits.
The US deficits, how big they are. Okay, let's do that. We'll do the US and then Elon. If you look at the US, just look at the balance sheet of the US. On the liability side, we have deficits. We have economic and political divisions and paralysis as a result. We have income inequality, and we have a variety of social challenges that are huge. That's on the liability side. I could add to that. On the asset side, we have, prior to, let's say, at election day, a very strong economy, the reserve currency of the world, the best AI by far, I would argue, including your comments about China, a dependence on China for certain things that might be on the liability side, the strongest allies history has ever known, a democracy that's flawed but large and strong, despite someone trying to take over the country. It didn't quite work. So we have a lot of assets. The net balance sheet is hugely to the positive. Each of the greatest universities, greatest science, greatest military, greatest law enforcement, each of those, the greatest media, arguably, other than the Economist.
I don't know about that.
Other than the Economist. But each of those things on the asset side seem to be being chipped at, I think, arguably. Is that a fair balance sheet, or how would you change that?
No, that's a very fair balance sheet, and I agree with you that it's massively net positive still, but that the assets or some of those assets are being chipped at, and I would perhaps add that some of the liabilities are not being focused on enough.
Right.
And so this is not if you ask me to bet on one country in the world, it would be the United States, without a doubt. But and I think again and again, it has been a mistake to bet against the US. But I think that's a really interesting framing. You're right, the assets are being chipped at. And the question is whether that chipping is the beginning, as we were saying just now, of a of a new system that will emerge more vibrant, whether this is the sort of birth pangs of something, death of the old and birth pangs of a new system, or whether it is a period where, you know, reserve currencies have been lost in the past, empires have fallen, you know, being number one isn't sort of immutable. And so I'm going to use that. I'm going to sort of shamelessly steal that framing. But if enough assets are chipped out for too long, and if you don't pay attention to your liabilities, you could suddenly end up in a considerably weaker position, you realize. And the one, and we spoke about it at the beginning at length, the one example I would give for that is the allies. The benefit that the US gets from this incredibly powerful alliance system would be weakened if the alliance system itself is weakened because the allies no longer trust the US.
Elon, what do you think of him?
I think he is, I mean, in every sense of the word, a remarkable individual. He is, you know, he will be in our grandchildren's history books with several chapters. He's extraordinary, right? In what he's achieved in terms of transforming entire industries in terms of, I mean, it's sort of Edison plus whoever. I mean, it's remarkable. He's also, I think now, in areas playing a destructive role. I think the government efficiency thing in principle is fantastic. I think that, you know, you actually, it's probably true that you can't incrementally achieve sort of radical change in terms of government delivery and so forth. So I'm 100% behind the idea of what Doge is trying to do. I think when you look at some of the implementation, it's a little questionable, but perhaps more important, I think now there is a kind of power kick that is coming from his dominance of a social media platform, his wealth, his proximity to the president, that is right now a sort of cult of personality that I think has downsides.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Really well done. Thank you.
Zanny, Mark, that was terrific. Thank you both for being here. And you've given us a lot to think about. So just looking ahead, as we always like to do, on Monday, the 17th, we have a webinar with Nathan Sheets of Citigroup. On the 20th, we have a luncheon featuring Jonathan Gray at Blackstone, and then Bill Gates on the 27th with the author series. We will also have a full month of events in April, starting with Mohammed El-Arian and Larry Fink, Austin Goolsbee, and Darren Ajamoso and Ben Loeb, actually. So it's a very busy April. We encourage you to keep tracking your calendars because there's more that is in your future between now and the end of June. And before we close, we always like to take a moment to recognize those members attending of the Centennial Society, which now number 400 actually, as their generous donations provide the backbone of financial support for our programming at the club. So we are going to say goodbye to our virtual participants, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And for everyone in the room, please enjoy your lunch. Thank you.